My name's Jennifer Cromarty. I'm the CEO of the Committee for Geelong, and this is the opening webinar on our Future of Work Forum series that is running this week. So there'll be a bit more detail at the end of the webinar about our next seminars during the week. But to kick off, I'd like to acknowledge Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people as Australia's First Nations people and traditional custodians of the lands and waterways. We pay respects to the Wadawurrung people of this land, their elders past, present and emerging, and the Committee for Geelong works closely with Wadawurrung traditional owners here in the region, and I just want to personally acknowledge the work that they're doing to share their story, their culture and their heritage. The Committee for Geelong has Corporate Plus members. We have 140 members, and I don't know if everyone who's logged on know who the Committee for Geelong are, but we're a not-for-profit group that has a bipartisan approach to designing Geelong's best future. So we do a lot of strategic thinking, research, advocacy, and really try and support what we think is good for Geelong's social and economic prosperities. And our Corporate Plus members are Bizanella, Bendigo Bank, GMHBA, NDIS, TAC, Victorian Region Channels Authority and WorkSafe. So many thanks to our Corporate Plus members. So I just wanted to have a couple of minutes just to give a bit of context before I hand over to Bernadette. But for those joining us for the first time, the Committee for Geelong launched its strategic framework. We have a 3-year framework, runs from 2019. All those seems like forever ago, 2019 to 2022. And it's outlined our key action areas. And one of the key action areas is the future of work. This was all pre-COVID. And we think it's even more pertinent to have these discussions in this environment. So we were thinking the future of work was really talking about what are those industries that are future-proofed, flexible, agile, but also technology and its impacts, and also the ways that we can now work. And prior to COVID, I'm not sure how many people had used this sort of technology to communicate and collaborate, but at the committee, I had been involved with organisations that had been using it, but what's happened is we've now had this accelerated experience that may be changing the way we work forever. So just in terms of context, the Committee for Geelong has worked quite closely with G21 Geelong Region Alliance. Elaine Carbines is involved with one of our conversations during the week, and they launched their learning scoping strategy or study I think it was late last year, and also the Gordon produced a report about workforce profile for the region back in June. Deacon's also obviously heavily contributed with their Jobs of the Future piece, which we'll hear about today. So the Committee for Geelong felt that with all this fantastic work going on in the region, what can we do to contribute? What are the things that we can do to help progress actions in those areas? So that's what this week is about. I just want to thank very much everyone who's here today, who's on the panel, and also very much to Bernadette O'Connor, who is our facilitator for today and the week. So what I might do is I'll hand over now to Bernadette, and I will stop my share and I will mute myself. So Bernadette, thank you so much, and I'll hand over to you to facilitate the discussion.
Thank you, Jen, and welcome everyone this morning to the Committee for Geelong's 2020 Future of Work Forum. Our first keynote speakers this morning are Professor Russell Tytler and Peter White. Professor Tytler is the Chair of Science Education at Deakin University. He's Deputy Director of the Centre for Research in Educational Futures and Innovation, and heads the very productive Science, Technology, Environmental and Mathematics Education Group. Coordinator of the Reimagining Futures in STEAM Research Group, He is also hubcap of the Victorian SciMer Rural and Regional Network. Professor Tytler has been visiting professor for universities in Hong Kong and in Sweden. Peter White is a Science Environmental Education Senior Lecturer at Deakin University. Peter has worked in classrooms as a curriculum consultant and manager, and as a teacher educator in several jurisdictions across Canada and Australia. Peter gained her PhD in Saskatchewan, Canada, where she focused on learning to live sustainably, which became a platform from which to educate future teachers. Her passion for initial teacher, educator, environmental education, and academic activist work, and action-orientated methodologies drives her current teaching and research scholarship. Professor Tytler and Peter White will be talking to us today about their work on 100 Jobs of the Future. So I'll hand over now to Professor Tytler and to Peter White for their presentation. Thank you.
Okay, thanks very much, Bernadette. I'm Russell Tytler, and
I'm Peter.
Peter, and we're in fact married, which explains why we're sitting here together under Melbourne lockdown, and we work together on the project we're about to report on. But before we start, we'd like to acknowledge the traditional owners of the land on which we're gathered today, and we pay our respects to elders past, present, and emerging. What we're talking about, and I hope you can see our screen, but it is a project that we were very involved in 2018, 2019, commissioned by Ford, looking at the future of work for young people. They were particularly interested in thinking about the sort of skills that young people should be thinking of developing and the sort of futures of work that they could expect to be a part of throughout their lives. When we talk about future, we were talking about 30 years hence. So it was a collaborative project with also Griffith University as well. The aims of the project basically were to look at the future of work and to look at the drivers of change that are so impacting even now in the last 5 years. Work has changed enormously, and you'd recognise these drivers of change. There's technological disruption, the big data and machine learning, and so forth, scientific innovation, materials development, climate change, and threats to the environment. We've all seen that in spades the last couple of years in particular, population changes and globalization. And so what we were looking at is what this implied for the future of work in different key industries and domains, and the jobs that will emerge in the future that perhaps will be surprising, perhaps will be different to what we experience today, that we need to think about preparing youth for. And in particular, because we were looking at this as a partly educative project, we were looking at the skills and interests that people need to take up these jobs and be suited for them. So at the outset of, or at least at the in the project, we also developed as an add-on what we call a job explorer tool to allow youth to think about what their skills and interests are and to be presented with jobs that are matched to those. So it was an educative project in that sense, and that's the website that the project has developed. So if you're interested and if you're watching while we talk, you can have a bit of an explore and go to that Job Explorer tool and find a job that suits you. So moving on, this is just a quick example of one of the jobs, which Peter's going to describe a few of them. It's a nanomedical engineer, an artist impression. For some of these jobs, Ford provided an artist to do that impression. In the first part of the project, what we did was to explore the literature, which consists of a lot of high-level reports to government as well as academic literature, looking at what's going to happen in the future. And one of the clear things that is a trend that is concerning and important to think about the sort of skills that young people need to develop is this change really from routine manual work, where jobs are disappearing, and the matched by an increase in the sort of non-routine cognitive work. And you'll see there that there are a couple of details in this graph that there's a slight rise in non-routine manual, but routine cognitive work, meaning the sort of middle level jobs that involve routine operations, are increasingly being taken over also by machines. If we could try Can you? Yeah. And what this means is that there's a hollowing out of workplaces, and the jobs being replaced by technology are going to be increasingly in the middle of the employment hierarchy. So you get this polarization predicted of jobs, with jobs in administration and sales will increasingly, it's predicted, disappear. And the jobs that are remaining will be increasingly characterized by non-routine thinking and levels of originality and creativity. Okay, just to put a little bit more focus on this, the jobs that are growing are those in things like community and personal services, professional jobs and management, but the jobs that are disappearing labouring jobs and administrative jobs. And the point made there in that quote is that a lot of the preparation implied in the education we're giving our youth at the moment are premised on skills that are not going to be that relevant for jobs of the future. And that includes a lot of trades. So we have a problem potentially with disruption to workplaces, Peter. And if you think about the skills that are going to be needed in the future, this is a prediction about the sort of skills that are needed in the future. And you see right at the top of the list there is digital literacy, not surprisingly, and critical thinking and creative thinking. And that's reflected actually in government policy around education, where critical and creative thinking is increasingly being touted as a general capability that we need to focus on. But I think even there, the education system is a bit slow to take it up. So what this means is that the future of work and the context of work is going to change dramatically, and it's going to look different. So there's a list there of the ways in which that that's going to change. Relationships are going to be increasingly important. People working for themselves, or at least moving around in the job market, is going to be increasingly prevalent. And that's happening now with the gig economy, for instance. In the past, people tended to be defined by the careers they had all their lives, but increasingly we're all needing to be more flexible in having more careers over a lifetime, and to have marketing or skills that one can market and move around. And this notion of lifelong learning is becoming increasingly important as well. And so there's a potential here actually for very rewarding jobs, but there's also the danger that if young people aren't aware of the need to develop these skills, then a lot of the jobs they might traditionally now go into are going to disappear. And so we need to prepare ourselves for these potential disruptions, is a strong message. Ford was particularly interested because they've got an innovation centre set up in Australia, which they're serious about trying to really gear up education for youth in Australia to focus on innovation. And so travel and mobility is one of the things they were interested in. Here's a job of the future that might reflect that. So just to, before Peter goes in to tell you what we found, just to characterise what we did. We looked at the research and writing, which I've just really gone through quickly about what the literature is saying about this. And we identified key domains in which these future trends were focused. And for each of these domains, we identified 11. We selected 11 experts, quite top people in their field, who Peter will introduce you to in a minute. And we interviewed those. And out of what they told us, we constructed 100 jobs, either directly from what they said, or taking what they said and thinking about, well, what does this mean for actually what might be happening? And then after that, we constructed the Job Explorer tool. So Peter, over to you.
Thanks. So if you look on the website that we presented right at the start, and if you've forgotten it, you could just Google 100 jobs of the future and it will come up pretty close to the top. you'll be able to meet our experts. So these are the 11 people that we interviewed. Again, just to reiterate Russell's structure of our project, we did a lit review to get ourselves into the field, thinking about the future of work. And then we came to these 11 people who are already busy thinking about futures in some way. You know, you'll notice here we've got representation from PricewaterhouseCoopers, of course, the Ford Motor Company with their Ford Futurist, representation across areas such as agriculture, commerce, with eBay and Google Australia, and also Frontier Materials represented by our Deakin University Institute for Frontier Materials, and then several people who think a lot about futures, some futures workers. So with this representation, we engaged in an interview strategy where we asked about their thoughts about the future and also their thoughts about jobs of the future. And from that interview, we found these key trends. It's not really different from the materials or the ideas that surfaced in the lit review, but I guess just further highlighted. So the impact of technology is key as we progress into the future. And you'll certainly see that in the jobs that we present through this report and for you here today. The environment of jobs will relate to new technologies, but also to lower energy production and to the idea of materials, rethinking materials. When we're asked about the future of work, often the idea of machines comes up, and we're asked, well, you know, will the robots be taking over? And to a certain extent, the answer is, I guess, yes. We'll be working in more of a close association with machines, but there is lots of work that comes from that kind of engagement with machines, not only the design of the machines, the construction of them, but then thinking about ways to work in collaboration with potential intelligent implants, this idea of the singularity where the line between humans and machines becomes more blurred. So the human-machine interface is a major focus of many of the future jobs that we will present to you through this report. And then I guess that also can come with some kind of dystopian concern and popularist fear, I suppose, about will humans be overrun by machines. So the key here is to finding ways to work with machines into the future. So as we designed the jobs, we paid attention to the skills that would be required to undertake this particular kind of work. And this will become more clear as we start to unpack some of the jobs. But it was very, very clear that these three themes came out. The idea of cross-disciplinarity, that there will be multiple people with specific skills forming collaborations to unpack solutions-orientated work. People using a multiple of disciplines, knowledge and skills infused with technology to come up with solutions, the managing of data, the collection of data. And it's this idea of being able to work across disciplinarities that leads us into the future. And STEM is a good example where key STEM teams are already infusing the key ideas across science, technology, engineering, and mathematics. There's a growing importance for human skills. So you'll see represented in a lot of the jobs that we present, there is a very strong interface between technology and humans. And so a lot of that is around how to work effectively across the community and what are these roles who are going to support and scaffold that kind of community embeddedness. And then a lot of flexibility and adaptability in the face of change. So as Russell mentioned, we're moving into the gig economy where we're constantly marketing our skills as opposed to falling into one career that is maybe disciplinary orientated and takes us to the end of our life. It's more of we're moving into more of a lifelong learning, a skill building, a marketing of your ability to move in and out of collaborations for work endeavors. So of the 100 jobs, many of them were described by our experts, but they're also based on projections about what has been said generally about the future work trends and of course, amalgamations across all of that. Some of them are surprising, some of them are intended to be provocative, and some of them will already reflect what we have. For example, the nostalgist is a job that curates, or someone who uses technology to curate the memories, possibly of an older person, possibly in a way that they could then share those memories with their families. Well, that's not particularly different to a biographer, someone that we're already familiar with and already has a strong role in our society. It's just that kind of job with a bit of a technological twist. So many of the jobs do have that kind of innovative design. There are 3D building designs, fusionists who pull together lots of the interfaces across multiple professions. There also are jobs with environmental concerns. For example, my favourite and my future career, the urban cricket farmer. There's also the weather control engineer and the de-extinction geneticist. So some future roles that indicate the possibility of maybe righting some of the wrongs or changing the way we do something like produce protein in our food systems. And so for each of the jobs, we give you a description of the actual job and then unpack some of the skills. Now, engaging with 100 anything is tricky. So we've categorized the jobs and then we've provided a way for you to engage. So this is what a jobs card will look like when you get into looking at them. As I said, there's a description up the top. The nature of the job is typically the next paragraph, and then the skills required for that job are unpacked at the end of the description.
That's actually quite a nice example of one of the trade jobs, a plumber, that's become technologised and much more kind of cognitive work involved that illustrates the sort of points we were making before.
No, that's fine. Here's my nostalgist, one of my potential future jobs. So again, fortunate to have an artistic representation, but it describes for you some of the elements of that role. So in order to help people engage with 100 jobs, we designed a Jobs Explorer tool. And so it's a web-based quiz with 4 questions. We used the Holland Code typology to design the questions that would then identify 6 codes that may characterize people's major career interests. And this was an opportunity to reflect back to the participant something about themselves that had been synthesized from their response to the fairly simple questions, but also allowed us to then engage with or provide to that person some of the jobs that might be more designed towards their interests. So the 6 codes or categories are practical, investigative, social, creative, enterprising, and organised. There are 18 areas of work. So once you've heard about your career interest, your typology, you then select an area of work that's of interest, and this then throws up for you your potential jobs. So if you go to the website that's listed there, you can take the quiz, and then you'll be asked 3 questions that look like this, where you shuffle the responses into the order of most like you at the top and least like you at the bottom. Then you're given your typology as a response. So you check and see if that fits you. If it doesn't, perhaps you would go back and redo the questions. And then you come to this categories of work, where you then select the areas that most interest you. And from matching these areas with your previous responses, your jobs are presented to you in the web format. And then you can, of course, explore those. So as we mentioned before, there's descriptive materials up the top to give you a sense of what that role might be, and then an unpacking of the skills towards the bottom of the description.
Okay, well, one of the things we did, in a sense, the 100 jobs becomes an interesting sort of microcosm of what the future might look like. And so we undertook an analysis of, well, what's the balance of these jobs that require, for instance, creative skills? One of our experts said you need to learn how to code and learn how to paint. This sort of matching of technological skills, STEM skills perhaps, and creativity. And so we coded all of the 100 jobs that were required, we judged would require creativity in some form. And some of those were in the creative industries, artistic sort of presentation jobs, perhaps production jobs, and some are the sort of jobs where you can see one needs to be imaginative and flexible, and a lot of those are STEM jobs. And you'll see that 82 of our 100 jobs have a high premium on creativity or creative thinking. And quite a lot of those, if you look down, primarily STEM jobs, 58 of those are STEM creative jobs. If you look down the bottom, all of them are creative jobs involving social intelligence. And so it's very interesting to think about this sort of movement away from routine jobs and into jobs requiring cognitive skills. They also require imaginative, critical, creative thinking skills. Okay, we try the next. Just as an informal analysis of the jobs, a lot of them are quite high tech. They imply reasonably high qualifications, but going through and looking at the ones that didn't necessarily imply a higher degree or a particular discipline, there are a number of jobs, and I think there are about 20 here, imply or could be taken up by people without those formal qualifications. But again, if you just run your eyes over those, you'll see that in fact they're not routine jobs either. They're jobs that might be mechanic sort of jobs, but they will require the working with technology, working with systems. Okay, try the next one. So what we did with this, because we're educators, we also designed some activities that careers advisors or teachers could use to alert students to the sort of jobs of the future that they might need to think about. And so they're on our website as well. And if we can go to the next one. And so I guess there will be questions coming out of all these presentations, but these are some of the questions I think might be interesting to think about with regard to the outcomes of this particular research. Do we need to change our education system to focus more on capability development? Is interdisciplinarity one of the key themes that we need to think about? What does it mean for disciplinary knowledge? My view would be that disciplinary knowledge is still very important, but the interdisciplinary setting, I think, is clearly flagged in these future jobs. And how do we, in fact, engage youth in thinking about the future in this way and preparing themselves for these? And what sort of skills do we need to foreground? So they're I think, some of the implications. Okay, thanks, Bernadette. I think hopefully that will stimulate some thinking.
Thank you very much, Russell and Peter. Mark has popped in. Mark Watson has popped in the chat. Can we? Yeah, very good. We've got the website up again. And Mark made a comment earlier in the chat about the Sustainable Development Goals as well, and creativity. Whether you'd like to, I don't know whether popping you on the spot about making some comment around that work at the global level around Sustainable Development Goals, just in the couple of minutes that we've got for some, but perhaps a minute or so for questions, and then we'll come back to the panel at the end with some further questions. Yeah.
I'll pass to Peter for that one.
Yeah, I think that's a great question. Wondering about the Sustainable Development Goals, the SDGs. They didn't really play out a lot in terms of our data to design the jobs, but I think you can see as you look through some of the jobs that there are definitely places to take up opportunities to explore the work of the SDGs. And part of that, I guess, is back to that explanation that we were giving around how some of these jobs can really showcase that there's a lot of work to be done in some particular areas, maybe rethinking how we've been operating, and that's certainly the underlying intention of a lot of the SDG work. So perhaps I'll leave it there for now.
But just to say, maybe we actually did toy with the idea of categorising the jobs in terms of sustainability, but it's very hard actually, because there's a lot of implied sustainability in a lot of these jobs. So for instance, if you talk to the people at Deakin from the Institute of Frontier Materials, so much of their work is around sustainable use of materials and circular economy. and so on. And so there's a sort of an overlay with a lot of these jobs, I think, with a sustainability theme.
And Russell, I think you must have been reading the chat as Ian's question came through, did you? Because he's just asking about what your research shows about energy usage and production sustainability into the future. And if you'd like to make just a little further comment on that, and then we'll move to Dr. Olney's presentation.
Yeah, well, I think, I mean, in terms of material production, certainly, as I say, the frontier materials, circular economy are pretty much implied in a lot of this. And jobs like the cricket farmer, for instance, and thinking about protein sources that are less energy and land intensive, for instance, is part of the driver for that. And a lot of the monitoring systems that are implying some of these jobs too would have that edge to them. Yeah.
Thank you very much, Russell and Peter, and keep those questions coming through on the chat as you reflect on their presentation around the 100 jobs of the future. I did go, when you said cricket farmer, to the fact that the AFL season is finished and we're into the cricket season, and somehow I was trying to conjure up a cricket farmer, but didn't quite get there. Our next keynote speaker, and I hope she won't mind me introducing her as my friend and dear friend, Dr. Sue Olney. Now, that's not to say Russell and Peter and Dan are not my friends, but I have known Sue for close to 20 years and have worked with her off and on over the years in various wonderful environments. Dr. Sue Olney is a research fellow in public policy with Melbourne Disability Institute, the University of Melbourne. She's an honorary senior fellow, Melbourne School of Government. She's with the University of Melbourne. She's a visiting fellow, Public Service Research Group, School of Business, the UNSW Canberra. And Sue is going to talk to us today about the value of a diverse labour force, which thinking about our 100 jobs of the future and the diversity in that those jobs and the emergence of the cognitive non-routine. I think it's really interesting to look at what's the value of a diverse labour force. So thank you, Sue. Oops.
All right, just give me a second to get this slide up. I'm on the wrong slide. Just bear with me for a second. Now, how's that? Can everyone see that slide?
Yes, all good, Sue.
Great, thank you. And apologies for that, that glitch. Now, Jennifer and Russell have both acknowledged the traditional owners. I just want to add my acknowledgement and pay my respects to elders past, present and emerging. I know that many people listening to this webinar will be sad about the grand final results. Bernadette alluded to that. For many people, it will be a season best forgotten. But of course, adapting to unanticipated circumstances will also be an opportunity seized by many people to change the way that the game is played, and particularly opportunities to move the grand final around. So I want to bear that in mind as we start to think about the value of a diverse labour force. So this is really a story about supply and demand for labour. And I know that there'll be a lot of discussion about that over this week. So I'm just going to move very swiftly through the introduction to this, which is, of course, that unsurprisingly, the COVID pandemic, particularly in Victoria, has had a big impact on recruitment and on business confidence. So if you look at the labour market information portal from the National Skills Commission, you can see that from a real low in April, recruitment rose in June in Victoria, but has dropped off again in August. Over the same period, though, recruitment was higher in regional Victoria compared to metropolitan Melbourne. So that's the demand side for labour. On the supply side, we know that there are many, many Australians looking for work, both unemployed and underemployed. And we also have many people on JobKeeper, what I've described here as time-limited government wage subsidies. And at this stage, we don't know how many of those people will join the unemployment queue when that wage subsidy trails off. So that's just in a nutshell. We'll see how much of that is addressed over the coming week. So what I'm going to talk to you about today are the sorts of economic and social risks that are looming when we're looking at that sort of imbalance between supply and demand in the labour market. And as the labour market is shifting and reshaped as a consequence of the pandemic, we're looking at a very real risk that the people who are marginalised already in the labour force will be locked out of work. And this can flow from just high general unemployment and competition for available work. It can be the risk, the historic risk of what we call a jobless economic recovery, which means that when business adapts to these sorts of shocks in a recession or changes to the way of working, that it won't return to the way that it operated before. And there's also emerging evidence that the pandemic itself may have lasting debilitating effects on individuals. So we may end up with more people who won't have full capacity to return to work. So the ripple effects of these sorts of risks will be very costly and far-reaching. And as Peter and Russell alluded to, these are global risks. So you know, the idea about decent work and economic growth is not a new theme. It hasn't risen from this pandemic. The 1994 OECD job study talked about the shift to the knowledge economy and the risk of leaving people behind in that environment, and their economic and social risks that arise from that. So as I said, it's not just the pandemic. The risks of the pandemic have been complicated by you would have heard a lot of discussion about existing fault lines in policies and systems. So the pandemic has exacerbated inequality in the labour market. So before the pandemic, we had around about 700,000 unemployed people looking for work and 1 million underemployed people seeking additional work. In the last 25 years, changes to the nature of work, the rise of the gig economy, the sort of portfolio career that Peter was talking about, the idea of moving in and out of jobs and projects and carrying your skills around from one job to another, has meant that a number of Australians were left without paid leave entitlements and in a more precarious situation when their job was not available to them suddenly. So that posed a risk. Now, of course, that doesn't sit comfortably. That kind of work doesn't sit comfortably with our welfare system either. Our welfare system is designed on the premise that people move from welfare to work, and that work is a job that has documented regular income. It's not designed for people to move smoothly in and out of income support when it's required. So this pandemic it's an unprecedented risk that's posed in terms of the labour force, because in the past we've had recessions, we've had pandemics, The government has learned lessons from all of those challenges. And what it knows is that stimulating the economy can contribute to the recovery. But in this current situation, we've got new and complex challenges because we've got entire populations at the moment in Victoria out of circulation, but we have to continue to deliver essential services. So what I really want to talk about today is what happens next. And why do we need to worry about whether our labour force is diverse? What happens if certain groups of citizens are not part of the economy and the labour force? So the opportunity that's come from this is that traditional ways of working, traditional ways of organisations behaving, and traditional customer bases have all been disrupted. So for many people, this pandemic has changed where and how their work gets done. So for someone like me who used to travel around everywhere and moved, seamlessly between Melbourne and Canberra, I've now been in a room on a video for 7 months. I'm still getting the job done. For some people, it will change the work that they do. And what's emerging is that it might change where they choose to live as well. Because if people are no longer having to live near a physical workplace, they can choose where to live. So this is in fact an opportunity to reset how work itself is organised, how productivity is measured, how we monitor performance in the workplace, and the sorts of business hiring and managing practices that can help people to build a more inclusive and diverse labour force. So why does that matter? Well, as I said, if there's not a job for everyone, we have to provide opportunities for people to create their own employment. They have to work out what their skills are that people are willing to purchase from them. Also, how inclusion and diversity can build really creative, resilient, and competitive businesses. And this builds on what Russell and Peter have said. Flexibility and adaptability in the face of change is crucial at a time like this. And if your workforce is comprised of people who are all thinking the same way, who all have the same experience of life, who all have the same perception of the world, then when something anticipated comes in, that group of people will think and respond the same way to what's happening. And so having a diverse workforce can in fact help you to be more resilient and to turn a business around quickly. From the point of view of government too, having a diverse workforce can help to flag fault lines in policy before it gets to the point where it causes damage. So, for example, if you have someone with a disability involved in developing the communication strategy for a response to COVID, that may well produce a better result than waiting to see what the impact of what you've come up with works in the world. So more broadly than government, what governments have to do is to build employers' confidence to tap into more diverse talent pools. So the three essential questions that people ask when they're recruiting their workforce, and you will have heard this often, is can the person do the job? Will the person do the job? And do they fit in? And often for marginalised job seekers, it's that last question that can be the barrier to employment. So what the government has to do is to say, we're moving into an economy where creativity, imaginative thinking, a gig economy relies on recognising people's strengths in particular contexts. And it may be that you need to think outside the square for the strengths that's missing in your business in order to capitalise on opportunities that come from an external crisis like this. It's also about recognising what skills are needed for the future and investment in that. And that's exactly the sort of work that needs to be underpinned by consultative, coordinated and data-driven effort of the sort that Russell and Peter do and many other people. So it's about saying, let's look, clear-eyed at what the world of work looks like in the future. Let's have some evidence about it rather than just hoping that we might bounce back to whatever was happening before. And all of these things are critical because we're looking at widening inequality and all sorts of economic and social flow-on effects that will arise from that in this imbalance in the labour market now. And that's not just something that will be outside the purview of every Australian. It's going to have implications. There will be people in the wake of this pandemic who will be living below the poverty line for the first time. And that will impact on all Australians, not just the people who have lost their jobs, not just the people who will find it hard to find work and to generate income in whatever comes in the wake of this pandemic. Also, we will be in a much stronger position to navigate and recover from this pandemic and also anything that comes after this, whether it be climate change, whether it be bushfires. We need to think now about harnessing the skills and potential of all Australians and to recognise the strengths that different people bring to work and to the life of the community. Now, some of that will be an immediate problem, and some of it will need strategic investment to plan for the future. So I might leave it there, and because I don't want to cross over with any other speakers, but I'm happy to answer questions.
Sue, thank you very much. Martin, in the chat, was in a way was talking, I think, about some touching back on creativity that both Russell and Peter talked about, but also that you've referenced in terms of that diversity in the workforce. We haven't necessarily, by and large, for a lot of our businesses, employed for creativity. We've sort of hoped it's there when we've wanted it, rather than necessarily specifically gone and looked for it. And Martin's talked about the role of artists in particular, but I'd just be interested in your view about the diversity of skills as well as the diversity of people.
Well, I'm going to be honest and say that I am a person who works in humanities, so I have a particular view about their value. I think they are invaluable. And if I were making policy now, I would be investing very heavily in education in terms of creative thinking, problem solving, and human interaction really is something that's going to be threaded through. It's going to be threaded through the future of work. And thinking creatively about the future is what will drive Australia forward. So too often in policy, the way that a problem is framed creates the way that the solution is arrived at. And so what we need is more people thinking differently about what the problem is and what's needed in order to come up with innovative solutions.
Whoops, just make sure my microphone's on. Sue, as a person who comes from a math science background, I love history, and I like to look back at history too. We looked to the global financial crisis and saw that what came out of that for our young people were partial jobs. And then you've raised this issue of out of our COVID crisis, do we have, as you said, a jobless economic recovery? What do you see the impact on our young people if we don't start to think very creatively about what we're doing in our economy?
Well, early exclusion from the job market can have lifelong consequences. So if someone doesn't move smoothly from education to work, for example, that can have a very long-term impact on their financial situation, on their and on their career, their lifelong work. I think that, but it's not just for young people. The work that I'm doing now is focused particularly on risks for people with disability in the future workforce. You know, there are significant costs associated with excluding people from being part of the economy and the labour force, and they're not just costs to the individuals involved or to society, but they're also missed opportunities for business, as I said, to have a different range of perspectives brought into identifying problems and finding solutions to those problems.
And Brett from it's just refreshed on me, as I said, Brett from Tourism Geelong, he's asked the question, and again, it's yours as well as crosses back to Russell and Peter's talk around the importance of soft skills and emotional intelligence. And I'd scribbled myself too, this really interesting to see how education drives this differently, in particular relating to human interaction, relationships and problem solving. We're challenged with how do we teach relationships? How do we teach problem solving? How do we teach creativity? How do we teach things that are really difficult to teach?
Well, they can be taught, but I think of what's more interesting is how do we measure their value? And one of the things that comes up often in my work is how much performance measurement drives the way people behave. And so we need to think about how we measure and value community connections, interaction between people. And these are things that are hard to measure, which is why we often fall back on the idea about setting outputs and outcomes and things that are measurable, particularly when you talk about accounting to shareholders or accounting to board members or citizens, even in terms of how you spend your money.
And
so
just
sorry.
Oh, sorry, Sue, I've interrupted you. Go on.
Yeah, so in terms of, we've seen that play out actually in vocational education and training for 30 years, as you well know, in this grappling with what are the core skills for work and how do we get employability skills into the sort of development of technical skills or professional skills. And this is an ongoing debate because ultimately the values of the employer and the organisational culture will make that decision about what the core skills for work are, although there are many attempts at it through government. But yeah, it's an ongoing debate.
It is. And just as we hand across to Dan as he gets ready, could you make a comment? Ian's posted in about universal basic wage as a safety net to embedding poverty as Dan gets ready for his presentation.
So me?
Yes, Sue, sorry.
Okay.
Yes.
Well, we actually have a very targeted welfare system in Australia. So a lot of the debate about the universal basic income has been around saying, we actually have quite a targeted and fair welfare system in Australia, which makes quite efficient use of the resources that we have. But I think moving into this new environment where there will be people in the welfare system who have not been in the welfare system before, I think we might see much more pressure to come up with something which is along the lines of a universal basic income, where we say we guarantee that people will have a certain level of income. And I think, as I said before, the issue of people being able to move in and out of income support when required is something that we really need to look at, because our welfare system at the moment is geared towards people moving into a job, and that is not the workforce of the future.
Thank you very much, Sue. I'm going to hand over now to Dan Nahum. Dan is an economist with the Centre for Future Work. His research interests include industrial transformation, labour markets in low carbon economies, government finances, and inequity and inequality. Dan's held roles in the Australian government in various social and economic policy fields, including Indigenous Affairs and the Office of Women for Women, and was also a union delegate with the Community and Public Sector Union. Thank you, Dan.
Thank you very much. Yeah, and thank you to all the speakers. I'd like to acknowledge that I'm speaking from Ngunnawal and Ngambri land, and that sovereignty was never ceded, and I'd like to pay my respects to elders past, present, and emerging. So I've got a bit of a slideshow as well, and I guess I'm sort of thinking about it from a macro but short-term perspective. Sort of what are the next big steps that we need to take to move into the next phase of our economic history, if you like. I really think that we are at a turning point, and we can either do something that's kind of business as usual, where we talk about doing big things but don't do them, or we can seize the moment. So I'll put up my slide deck as well, and hopefully this will work smoothly. Here we go. Hope everyone's seeing that okay. Great, okay. So yeah, I've called my slide deck "Economic Recovery in the Era of COVID-19" to reflect the idea that I am thinking about it in the near term. But I think it's more than just economic recovery. I think it's actually economic reconstruction, and I'm a little bit sorry that I didn't call the presentation "Economic Reconstruction in the Era of COVID-19", because I think it's really about building a new normal and building a better normal than the one that we had before. And the question of universal basic income that was just raised a moment ago is actually a really interesting one, because for a moment there we actually had one. We doubled unemployment benefits and we removed mutual obligation. So we can obviously do it. And I think, like, in terms of the real resources that were being consumed, I mean, it's not like inflation spiked or anything like that. So, you know, I think the range of political possibility and economic possibility is much greater than we're used to thinking. So just in terms of thinking about what has actually just happened, so we had something that was initially, I mean, a health crisis and then a supply shock, and then that led to a demand shock as, you know, businesses let people go. Essentially, and so then incomes dropped and people stopped consuming as much, and so you had this spillover effect throughout the economy. So we now have a recession, and the question is whether it's going to turn into a depression or not. That's actually the decision that we need to make now. So just a little bit of an overview of where we're at right now. Just a few stats there. Just the second dot point there, the employed but worked 0 hours figure is for August rather than September, just if I'm going to be completely straight up with you about that. Those are the latest figures. So if you think about the official unemployment rate plus the people who have lost hours, plus those who have left the labour force altogether, because you have to be looking for work to count as unemployed, we actually think the real unemployment rate is in the vicinity of 20% nationwide rather than the 6.9% that you see there. The salt on the wound is that youth and women have been more likely to be sacked, partially because of the fact that they're more likely to be working casual jobs, and partially because of the fact that there's kind of a you know, sort of last to be hired, first to be fired dynamic that applies to youth. And so they've been leaving the jobs market altogether at higher rates as well. Customer-facing sectors have been harder hit. Also kind of centres of gravity for the employment of youth and women. You know, higher incidence of insecure jobs amongst those demographics as well. And I think one of the big design flaws with JobKeeper was the exclusion of short-term casuals and migrants. So that was 2 million people who were excluded effectively. So just in terms of industry job losses for Victoria, I just whipped these up out of the ABS statistics. So you can see that, you know, some of these are not really a surprise. So accommodation and food services has taken a really big hit as travel has stopped, essentially. Some of the others, it's not as obvious why they would have dropped as much as they have. Administrative and support services, for example. Manufacturing, obviously that supply followed by demand shock that I talked about. Arts and recreation, that's very much tied up in well, obviously the health side and the performance, you know, not being able to give performances, but also tied to the tourism sector quite umbilically. Yeah, so it's interesting to see that a few industries have actually gone up since February. So without a government-led reconstruction plan, this is what we expect the recovery to look like. So we've had that big initial dip that really sort of reached its trough in May. We seem to be experiencing a partial rebound right now as the economy reopens nationally. I think that might maybe less the case in Victoria because of the effect of Melbourne on the numbers. But even once Melbourne reopens, unless there's a plan for a government-led recovery, we expect that we won't get back to where we were. Not soon, anyway. So we call that the Loch Ness Monster recovery. Now, I just want to demonstrate to you with this slide that what we're actually talking about is not new. The economic stagnation that we were experiencing well and truly preceded COVID. So this slide's about business investment as a proportion of GDP. So essentially, you could say that businesses were less willing to invest in themselves, even prior to COVID, than they had been in the past. A third lower than they had been in 2013 by the time we got around to sort of 2018, 2019. So, you know, for a little while we were talking about this idea of a snapback. Well, I'd put it to you that the economy wasn't in a position to snap back even without the advent of COVID. And one of the reasons for this low level of investment is low wage growth. So there's a certain degree of substitutability between labour and machines and you know, labour and research and development. So under these circumstances, it can make sense to just pay workers because, you know, you're paying them low wages rather than to improve productivity through updating your, you know, fixed capital, your machines, essentially, your factories. So in that economic configuration, you're foregoing the possibility of setting off a virtuous cycle of higher wages followed by higher productivity, followed by higher wages, and so on. And so essentially, I'd say kind of we were in second gear even before COVID and before the bushfires. So what this also says is that at least in the immediate term, the robots aren't coming. And it's true, there are kind of these new third-party interfaces like Uber or whatever. But if you actually think about what they do, the economic relations sitting under Uber, so, you know, the relations between the worker and the employer and the customer, they're no different from piecework, you know, sort of Dickensian times. And they're no different from the Hungry Mile during the Great Depression. You're still talking about, you know, the gig economy has been with us for a very long time. So we'd like to point out that the attacks on wages are actually self-defeating in terms of economic recovery and in terms of improving economic growth and consumption. So even before COVID, wage growth was already stagnant, as I mentioned. There are new attacks on wages. I mean, I think some elements in the business sector are certainly seeing an opportunity to go after wages with the COVID crisis. They're saying we can't afford to pay wages more and pay workers more. And to some extent that might be true, but it's also opportunistic and it's also damaging in the medium and long term. And why is that? It's because of these false assumptions, you know, sort of low, you've all heard it, lower wages will create or protect jobs, or shared sacrifice is fair. Well, wages are actually the purchasing power in the economy. They're the purchasing power of the private sector. So if you're going to pay lower wages, essentially what you're doing is you're stymieing the recovery of the business sector as well. But the government has a hand in this as well. And of course, it can directly hire people, and it can also sort of take its foot off the brakes as far as restraining public sector wages. So we'd like to say that the public sector wage caps in Victoria and the freeze at the Commonwealth level, they're especially unfortunate because of the spillover effects of public sector spending into the private sector, right through the broader economy. So collectively, there should be, and I think is, a fight to defend wages and rights. So again, showing you that this well and truly predates COVID. This is falling labour share of GDP. So this is the amount of money that workers are taking home as a proportion of GDP. And you can see that it's been stagnant or falling for a long time now, decades, in fact. So that's got to do with a few different elements, and economic historians will talk about them all day. You know, the declining role of unions in the workplace, and you know, individual agreements between workers and employers, you know, less collective bargaining. So moving into the next part of the presentation, we'd like to talk about what a recovery might look like, what building back better might look like. And so we kind of think about it in terms of the recovery from World War II. I mean, there are obviously differences, but there are also some strong historical parallels as well, in terms of just looking at an economy that really has suffered a great deal, and thinking about a social vision for the next stage. And really, if you think about what happened in Australia, by 1942, the Curtin government had already put in place a plan for post-war reconstruction. And in the decades that followed World War II, the Australian middle class was built. So that was broad-based wealth like Australia had never experienced before. So the reason we think that government intervention is so important at this point, and we're not being ideological about this, this is just about building a successful, vibrant and resilient mixed economy. At the moment, the private sector is too damaged to lead this normal recovery. That snapback's not going to happen. So some elements that we'd like to see as part of that recovery is repairing and strengthening the health system. Certainly, you know, as our chief economist at the Australia Institute, Dr. Richard Dennis, likes to say, when the tide goes out, you see where the rocks are. And I think that we've seen some of that in terms of some of the vulnerabilities that our health system has had. I think we've certainly dodged some bullets in Australia, but that's as much by good luck as good planning. sustained public infrastructure investment, climate transitions around energy and transport, and I'm going to talk about energy and manufacturing in a little while, non-market housing, again, those are some of the rocks that have been exposed by the tide that has gone out. We already had problems with housing stress and the affordability of housing in Australia and especially capital cities prior to COVID. We knew about them, we weren't doing much about them. Here's our opportunity to get on that. Permanent expansion of public services and hiring, because those services are vital. And again, even before COVID, we knew a lot of communities were underserviced. And revitalising manufacturing will be important. And I'll talk about why that is right now. So at the moment, Australia is the least manufacturing self-sufficient nation in the OECD. And that's a real problem. And it's another dodged bullet, really, in terms of shortages of manufactured goods during the crisis. And so obviously that includes the stuff that people think of like personal protective equipment and medical equipment and so on. But even just sort of everyday exports that we rely on just to get by as householders, we were relying on imports at a time where international trade was pretty sketchy, to say the least. And so we think that manufacturing is really important because of the way it anchors so much of the rest of the economy. And also it supports good jobs. Historically, it's supported a lot of full-time, high-quality, well-paid jobs. So here are some reboots or strategies to reboot manufacturing. So these are really directed at the Commonwealth government, but they're applicable to state and even local governments as well. So fiscal supports, support for applied innovation and R&D. We certainly need to reevaluate the way that vocational education and training is done in this country. Government procurement. So, you know, often when governments think about procurement, they go for the sort of best value for money, by which they mean cheapest option. But governments aren't like private companies. They don't have to think in terms that narrow. They can think about best value for money in terms of the broader social consequences of their decisions. And leveraging sustainable energy is a key competitive advantage in Australia. So I recently wrote a pretty big paper on this called Powering Onwards, but also Ross Garnaut's book Superpower came out recently, talking about Australia's superabundance of renewable energy, as well as Michael Lord's From Mining to Making paper on how we should be using our renewable energy. So these are all really important resources. Those aren't the only ones, incidentally. So there's just a lot on how we've failed to capitalise on our renewable energy resources in Australia to drive a more complex economy than the one that we have. So, you know, I talked about undercapitalisation, and you know, it kind of seems like the Commonwealth are kind of sceptical of renewable resources. They're not as openly hostile towards renewables as they used to be, apart from, you know, sort of some backbenchers here and there. But they're not really doing a great deal. So for that scepticism to be justified, I mean, you've heard all of this stuff before. Maybe renewables are too expensive, not available in sufficient quantities at the right times and locations, less reliable maybe, or not suitable for certain industrial purposes. But in fact, none of this is true. Renewables are appropriate for most manufacturing uses, with the remaining holes being plugged as we speak. For example, using hydrogen in steel making instead of metallurgical coal. So that's a chemical process rather than an energy input. And there are lots of examples in that Powering Onwards report that I mentioned a moment ago that identify different applications for renewables in manufacturing, and also showing how we can and should manufacture more domestically to capture the value of our renewable endowment. So, for example, a domestic lithium-ion battery industry, and of course, you'd all know about the wind turbine components being produced at the old Ford plant. We think those operations are scalable and should be scaled. So I talked about, you know, the question of expense. Let's have a look at the government's own figures on comparative electricity costs. This is what's called the levelized cost of electricity. So what that takes into account is both the capital or the installation costs of these different energy sources, and also the marginal or running costs. So that's your fuel and your maintenance, essentially. So note that the cost of renewable energy, so if you have a look at the third set of columns here, that's already really low, much lower than the cost of newly installed gas. So much for that transition fuel argument. It's lower than the cost of coal. And even when you bring in battery storage or pumped hydro to give you that firming that people talk about renewables needing, it's still cheaper. So, and will become cheaper over time as well. So none of these figures include a carbon price. If you included a carbon price, they're even more competitive. There's a small risk premium associated with fossils, and that represents the possibility that there might be a carbon price in future. And also it represents the availability of fuel. So if you use the levelised cost of electricity in Australia's current energy mix as a basis, and you suppose we replace our current energy mix with renewables rather than simply replacing the coal plants with more coal plants and the gas plants with more gas plants, the manufacturing sector saves almost a quarter of its electricity bills. So this is about new power generation. This is about expanding the manufacturing sector or the replacement of old power. And, you know, these aren't actually far-fetched assumptions, because a lot of existing fossil generators are reaching the end of their working lives in the short to medium term anyway. You can actually go on the Australian Energy Market Operator's website and have a look at when they're scheduled to be decommissioned. And it's, you know, it's a lot of generators pretty soon. So I use really conservative assumptions to discover this, and you know, that's these are all including pumped hydro storage as well. So I factored in that firming. There are a lot of ways that you could calculate this. So my estimate is indicative, but I know that I was conservative because I actually had a look at what big companies like BlueScope Steel and Carlton United Breweries are saving from their power purchase agreements. That means that they're only using the output of renewable energy generation. And they're saving 50% on their energy bills in some cases. So yeah, definitely manufacturing could be a lot more competitive if we were taking better advantage of our renewable resources. So, you know, I guess really what this is about is what sort of investment should we undertake when we do new capital spending? We're talking about this gas-fired recovery at the moment. So I think this is a really timely question. The government is spending a bunch of money on the future shape of the economy. And the question is, are they spending the money on the right things? And I think the installation of this new green grid and a reinvigorated and expanded Australian manufacturing sector would mean a whole lot of high quality blue collar jobs that aren't there now. And many of them will use skill sets generalizable from present day fossil fuel industries. So for example, the electrical trades. So this looks at the popularity of renewable manufacturing and takes polling data from 3 different sources. But what you'll notice about that graph is that there's an unavoidable arithmetical overlap between the 3. The positive responses are so high that you've got to have like a fairly large critical mass of people who think all of these statements are true. And all of these results are from before COVID-19 and also before the bushfires. So I think that probably, if anything, they'd be higher now. And I kind of envision, you know, I was talking a moment ago about you know, the Vestas manufacturing wind turbines at the old Ford plant, and I mentioned that was scalable. I kind of envision a virtuous cycle of using our new renewable grid to make more renewable power resources and so on. So again, that circular economy idea.
Dan, we've got about 30 seconds or so left so that we've got some room for questions that have been coming in fast.
Okay, thanks for letting me know. I'll skip past a few slides, but I do want to show you these ones quickly. So just to give you a sense of where we are in terms of the manufacturing sector's proportion of GDP and carbon dioxide emissions per capita. I know this is a detailed graph, but I'll show you where we are. So that's us down there in the naughty corner with Luxembourg. So we're emitting a whole lot and we're not manufacturing very much at all. So I call this the bad place graph. So we're in the worst of all worlds there. Where you'd like to be is in exactly the opposite corner. So we're kind of like a petrostate, sort of like a developing economy. Ironically, we're one with these amazing renewable resources on hand that we're just failing to use. You know, even the United States and Canada, you talk about their manufacturing sector having been hollowed out and them not really taking advantage of their renewable sectors, but they manufacture twice as much as us. So I'm going to skip past the recommendations that are in my report. If anyone wants to read them, they're in the Powering Onwards report on the Centre for Future Work's website. We will have higher public debt, but that's okay. That's actually something that needs to be done at this stage, and we should celebrate it because it's the flip side of public investment. And we've done it before. We did it post World War II. All right, last slide. So it will be an unprecedented and painful economic crisis, and there are dangers at hand, but there's an opportunity as well. So gives us a chance to recognise the value of jobs that perhaps haven't been properly valued in the past. Also, the importance of public services and social infrastructure. And I guess when I talk about social infrastructure, I mean the foundational economy. So, you know, caring sectors, rediscovering the importance of manufacturing domestically, and creating a new model of growth which pays proper attention to democracy and focuses on meeting human and planetary needs. So thanks very much.
Thank you,
I'm
Dan.
sorry I went over time.
Thank you. We've got some, I actually wrote down several questions, but the other quick questions have been coming in, so we're going to leave mine. Dan, I might get you to stop sharing, and I think Jen's going to give me some power to go to Jane Wager had a question, I think. Jen's just going to, there we go. Jane, can you, did you still have your question to ask, Jane? And you're on mute at the moment, Jane. I might have to just, no, Jane's not there. Jen, I'll go to you because first of all, and while Jane's perhaps going to come back to us maybe when she's ready. So Jen, you
might have
a question
taken
as
too
well.
long for Wage. She's doing other things. No, I had a question. It can be for any of the panelists, but we've talked a lot about flexible work and the use of technology and, you know, emotional intelligence and soft skills and universal income ideas, as well as the labour market. So my question is around the 38-hour working week. And if everyone knows me, I really don't like this idea that we're bound to our desks 9 to 5. I think COVID's really challenged and given opportunity for employers, particularly understand how to support workers in a flexible work environment. So my question is for any of the experts here today is, will this be the circuit breaker for not just employers but government to stop talking about FTE in the way that they measure either government funding or success or how people are being hired, and maybe look at the opportunity for more people maybe to work less hours, potentially opening up other opportunities in the job market, or just for that complete transformation around what it means to be flexible?
So Dan, I'll get you to make a comment on that first. And Sue, I think as well, you've talked about that changing work and yeah. Dan, if you'd like to comment first.
Thanks. Yeah, it's a great question. I think I think again we're at an inflection point there where, I mean, before this crisis, the Centre for Future Work was pretty interested in reduced working hours, the 4-day working week, or shorter working days, like with Volvo in Sweden. And what those examples suggest is that you actually get higher productivity to a point because you know, people just essentially use their time more effectively while they're at work. So output doesn't necessarily have to drop even if hours do. So I think from an employer perspective, it's a really good thing. You know, they're paying less for power bills, they're paying less for real estate, you know, this whole working from home thing. I think we've just basically found ourselves sort of shoved into a new stage of Australia's corporate culture, hopefully. And so I think my answer to your question is yes. And really we need to kind of keep the eye onto employers' feet around the changes that have been discovered, if you like, and just basically save on congestion and have more flexibility, and yeah, I guess just a better work-life balance.
Sue, would you like to just make a couple of second comment on that as well?
Yeah, so often demand for flexibility of work is often cited as the move towards more casualised working arrangements. It comes up often, but it's very geared to people, particularly to dual income households or to people who don't have ongoing responsibilities that require a regular sustained wage at a particular level, you know, if they're borrowing money or if they need to be living somewhere in particular. So there are, you know, there are reasons on both sides why that matters. I think there'll be people who will demand to work differently in future because they've had the experience of working the way they have now, and that will be a factor. But by the same token, I mean, our house has become a complete, flexible, open plan office with everybody in the household jostling for a tabletop to put their laptop on. And that's not sustainable. We've discovered that. So while employers might say, oh, it's wonderful, we no longer need an office building, they're actually using my house as a free workspace. So that needs to be factored in as well. So yeah, it's a double-edged sword, but it's also about how we measure performance, and it's about balancing risk and accountability in arm's length organisations.
Thank you, Sue. I'm going to go back now. We've got to 12:30 to Jen to close us out. For the last 30 seconds or so, we probably didn't have our minute or so to do it. We've heard about working in different jobs very differently, learning differently, the structure of work being different, and in fact governing differently from our speakers today, governing and working economically differently. So Jen, I'll just pass to you to close us out for our opening session for the Future of Work Forum.
Yeah, and conscious that we're right on time. So I just want to thank everyone today, particularly obviously the speakers. I've found this incredibly interesting and helpful